The train came in at 2:30, which was late even by the standards of a line that ran late as a matter of policy. The platform at Callow Creek was unpainted wood, gone gray from 3 winters of standing open to the weather, and the October wind came down off the flats with nothing to slow it. A few men stood near the depot doorway, not waiting for anyone in particular, just watching, the way men in small towns watch when a train arrives. She stepped off the last car. She was carrying a single bag, not large, the kind a woman carries when she has made decisions about what to leave behind. Her dress was brown wool, high at the collar, long at the sleeve, despite the fact that wool in October on the high plains runs warm enough by midday. She stood on the platform and looked at the street the way a person looks when they are orienting themselves without wanting to appear to be orienting themselves. Chin level, eyes steady. One of the men near the doorway said something to the other. Neither of them moved. She walked to the edge of the platform and stepped down without assistance. The town was 2 streets of consequence, and a handful of others that didn't quite commit to being streets yet. A general store, a livery, a barber who also pulled teeth and had opinions about both, a church that held services every other Sunday because the circuit preacher had a wide circuit, a boarding house run by a woman who had outlived 2 husbands and showed no particular signs of softening for having done it. She went to the boarding house first. The woman at the desk looked at her bag, at her collar, at the absence of anyone accompanying her, and named a price that was higher than it should have been by $1.50. She paid it. She was shown to a room on the second floor that had a window facing the alley and a bed, with a quilt that had been washed so many times it had gone soft and colorless. She sat on the edge of it. Outside the window, the wind moved through the gap between buildings and made a sound that was almost, but not quite like something familiar. She had come about an advertisement. A rancher 3 miles out of town had placed a notice in a paper 2 states over. Practical work, room and board, help needed with a household that had been running without enough hands since spring. The notice had used the word respectable twice, which she had read carefully. She had written back. He had written again. 4 letters in total, brief and factual, the way a man writes when he is trying not to ask the questions he actually has. She had not told him everything. There was a great deal she had not told him, and some of it she wore every day beneath the wool and the high collar and the long sleeves that stayed down no matter the weather. She slept poorly. The wind kept at the gap between buildings all night, and at some point before dawn, a horse went past in the alley at a pace that suggested urgency without explaining it. She lay on the soft quilt and watched the ceiling grow lighter by degrees and thought about the letters. 4 of them. She had read each one more than once. He wrote the way a man speaks when he has decided to be careful. Short sentences, no decoration. The work is steady and would suit someone not afraid of early mornings. The house has 3 rooms downstairs and 2 above. My son is 7 and accustomed to quiet. That was the first letter. The second had answered her questions directly, without elaboration. The third had mentioned, once, that the previous arrangement had ended in the spring without offering anything further about why. She had not asked. The fourth letter had arrived on a Thursday, and she had not written back until the following Monday, not because she was uncertain, but because she needed to be sure of her own handwriting when she did. She rose before the town, dressed in the order she always dressed. Sleeves first, then the high collar fastened to the second button, then everything else. She did not look at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. She had not done that in some time. Downstairs, the woman who ran the boarding house was already in the kitchen. She offered coffee without being asked, which was the first uncomplicated thing that had happened in several days, and they sat in the kitchen for a few minutes without speaking, which suited her exactly. She had arranged to be met at 10. That was what the last letter had said. I will come to town Thursday morning, if that is acceptable. I will be at the livery by 10 acceptable. That word, too, she had read more than once. She had time. She walked the main street of the town slowly, the way you walk when you are trying to understand a place before it understands you. The general store was just opening. A man in an apron was sweeping the boardwalk outside the barber's. Across the street, two women stood talking with their heads inclined toward each other, and one of them glanced at her and said something quietly to the other. And she kept walking. She knew that look. She had been arriving in places long enough to know it. At 9:45, she was standing at the edge of the livery yard, her bag at her feet, watching the road that came in from the west. The morning was cool, and the light was still low and pale. She had her hands folded in front of her. Her sleeves were down. A wagon appeared at the far end of the street, moving without hurry through the thin morning dust. She did not move, she watched it come. The wagon came in slowly, the way wagons do when the driver is not in a hurry and has no reason to pretend otherwise. A single bay horse, a flatbed with a toolbox roped to the side and something covered in canvas at the back. The man holding the lines was broad through the shoulders and had his hat pulled low against the flat morning light. He did not look at her until he had pulled the horse up and wrapped the lines and climbed down. Then he looked, directly and without apology, the way a man looks when he is trying to take an honest account of something. She looked back. He was older than she had expected from the letters. Not old, but he had been used by the years in a way that was visible, in the line of his jaw, in the unhurried way he moved, in the fact that he did not seem to need her to think anything about him. He said her name, just that. A question, but barely. She said yes. He nodded once and picked up her bag from the ground beside her before she had moved for it. She did not thank him. The offer had not seemed to require it. He said the ride was about 40 minutes. He said the road was rough past the creek crossing but smooth after. He said there was coffee in a canteen behind the seat if she wanted it. He said all of this in the order you would say useful information, and then he did not say anything else. She climbed up to the bench. He came around and got up on the other side and unwrapped the lines. The town fell away behind them. The road opened into open country, dry grass, a scattering of cedar, the sky wide and pale and enormous in the way that sky is out here when you are new to it. She watched the land come at her and let it. He drove without comment. The horse knew the road. After a while, she said, "Your letter mentioned a cook had just left," he said she had. Said she'd gone back east in October. Said he had managed well enough through the winter, but that was not the same as managed. She asked what the position required. He said, 3 meals, laundry once a week. Nothing else that isn't asked. She heard the edge of that. The border he was marking before it needed marking. She appreciated the plainness of it. She said she could do that. He said, "I know. I read your letter." The creek crossing came and the wagon lurched and she put one hand on the bench rail and he did not look over to check on her, and she was glad for that. Past the creek the road smoothed out, the way he had said it would. She let her hand come off the rail. The ranch appeared at the top of a long rise, still a half-mile off, sitting low and plain against the pale sky. The ranch was not what she had pictured. She had pictured something rougher, boards pulling away from the frame, a yard given over to mud and equipment. What she saw instead was plain and kept. The fence line ran straight. The barn doors were hung level. A cord of split wood stood stacked against the south wall of the house, the cuts all facing the same direction. Someone had taken care here and kept taking it, even through a winter alone. He pulled the wagon around to the side of the house and stepped down before it had quite stopped, moving to the horse's head without hurry. She climbed down herself. He did not come around to assist, and she did not wait. The yard was quiet except for the wind and somewhere a gate swinging on its hinge. He led the horse toward the barn. She stood with her bag and looked at the house. The porch ran the full width of the front. One of the boards near the step had a soft spot. She could see it in the slight depression of the grain, the way the wood had given under years of weight. A tin candle holder sat on the porch rail, weathered to the color of the sky, a short stub of tallow inside it. She did not know why she noticed it. She noticed it. He came back from the barn and went past her to the door and held it open. Inside was dim and smelled of wood smoke and coffee grounds and something underneath that, not unclean, just long inhabited. A single large room held the cook stove, the table, 4 chairs. A narrow hallway ran toward the back. He showed her the room at the end of it, small, a window facing east. A quilt on the bed in a double wedding pattern, the colors faded to the same pale tone. A hook on the wall and nothing hanging from it, he said. Water comes from the pump outside. Privy is past the barn. She set her bag on the bed. He said, I'll start morning chores at 5. Breakfast whenever after that suits you. She said 6. He nodded once and left her to it. She stood in the room for a moment after his boots faded down the hall. Outside, the wind shifted. The gate stopped swinging. She went to the window and looked out at the yard, the fence line, the straight wood stacked along the wall, and in the near distance, the pale stretch of land going on without feature until it met the sky. She unpacked her things in a particular order. The dress she had worn on the train she folded last and set at the bottom of the bag, and the bag she slid beneath the bed. She had not put it in the wardrobe. She had not hung it on the hook. She did not think about why. She slept without dreaming, which was not always the case. When she woke, the room was still dark, but the dark had the quality of something almost finished. She lay a moment and listened, boots on the porch boards, the low sound of the barn door, the particular drag of wood that had swollen with winter and never quite settled back. She rose and dressed in the cold. The kitchen was empty, but the stove had been fed. The iron still ticked with new heat. She found flour in the tin beside the window, salt in a small clay pot, lard in a covered pail under the shelf. There was a cast iron pan hanging from the wall, and a Dutch oven, and a coffee pot that had been set to the edge of the stove to stay warm. She worked without lighting another lamp. The gray coming through the east window was enough. By the time his boots came back across the porch, there was coffee poured, and biscuits in the pan, and a plate of side pork she had found hanging in the pantry, sliced thin and laid flat. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at the table. He did not say anything. He pulled out the chair nearest the stove and sat down and wrapped both hands around the cup. She sat across from him. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that forms when two people have separately decided not to fill the air with things that don't need saying. She had lived in enough kitchens to know the difference. Some silences press. This one settled. He ate steadily without rush. She watched him in the way she had learned to watch. Not directly, but in the peripheral way of someone accustomed to reading a room for its temperature before committing to it. There was a small thing she noticed. On the shelf above the dry sink, between a tin of matches and a folded cloth, there was a candle in a holder. The holder was plain tin, hammered not cast, and the candle had burned down nearly to the collar. It had been there a long time. The wax around the base had run and cooled and run again, until it formed a low ring that fixed the holder to the shelf as firmly as if it had been nailed. She did not ask about it. He pushed back from the table when he was finished and carried his plate to the dry sink without being asked. He rinsed it himself. He said, "There are chickens that need tending if you're willing." She said she was willing. He took his hat from the peg beside the door and settled it on. He looked at her once, briefly, the way a man looks at something he is still deciding how to account for, and then he went out. She cleared the table. The candle on the shelf had not been lit. The chickens were kept in a low coop behind the house, 8 of them, and they were not friendly. She had tended chickens before, knew their smallness and their meanness both, and she went about the work without ceremony. She found the feed in a covered pail just inside the coop door. She found the water dish tipped and righted it and filled it from the pump. The birds regarded her with the flat suspicion. Birds carry everywhere they go. She counted 7 eggs. She brought them in and set them in a bowl on the table and then stood for a moment in the kitchen, which was quiet in the way of a room that has been quiet for a long time. Not empty, quiet. There is a difference. Empty rooms feel large. This room felt like it had been held at a particular size for years, arranged around the habits of one person who had stopped expecting it to hold more than that. She put water on to heat and wash the morning's dishes. Then, she looked at the rest of the kitchen the way she had looked at the room the night before. Slowly, without hurry, reading what was there. There was flour but no cornmeal. There was a half round of salt pork wrapped in cloth. There were dried beans in a crock and a good iron pot and two skillets, one larger than the other, both well seasoned. There was a jar of something dark she opened and smelled. Molasses. Not much left. There was bread from 2 days ago, still edible but going. There was no butter. She began to take stock in the way she had always taken stock, which was quietly and completely, touching nothing twice. By the time the water was hot, she knew what the kitchen had and what it lacked. And she had begun to think in the background of her thinking about what could be done with the one to offset the other. This was a thing she had learned young. You do not mourn what is absent. You work with what is present. The two orientations look similar from the outside, but they are not the same at all. She put the bread in a cloth and set it to one side. She would use it for supper rather than let it go further. He came back mid-morning with mud on his boots and left them on the step the way a man does when he is accustomed to being alone and then remembers, halfway through the door, that he is not alone anymore. He set them outside and came in his stockings and poured himself water from the pitcher on the sideboard and drank it standing up. He looked at the bowl of eggs on the table. He looked at the kitchen, which had been rearranged only slightly. The pot moved, the cloth rewrapped, but rearranged all the same. He did not say anything. He set his glass down and went back out. She watched him from the window. He crossed the yard to the barn and did not look back. The door swung behind him and settled, and she stood with her hands on the edge of the basin and let the moment pass through her without holding it. The eggs would keep until midday. She covered the bowl with the cloth and went to the back room where her trunk sat open against the wall. She had not fully unpacked it. She told herself this was practical. She might need to move again, and quickly. But the truth was simpler than that. A closed trunk is easier to close the rest of the way than an empty one. She lifted out the fabric she had brought. Two lengths of it, plain gray wool, the kind that wore well in cold weather and did not show dirt between washings. She had planned to make herself a second dress when she arrived somewhere she intended to stay. She set both lengths on the bed and looked at them. Then she put them back and closed the lid. He came in for the midday meal, and she had made soup from the salt pork, and two of the potatoes she found, stored in the cellar. She had not asked. She put a bowl in front of him and one across the table for herself and sat down. He looked at the bowl. He picked up the spoon. They ate without speaking. Outside, the wind had come up, and the loose board on the far side of the barn made its irregular sound. Not quite a knock, not quite a creak, but something between the two that came at intervals she could not predict. He heard it too. She could tell because he paused once, spoon raised, and listened. Then he went back to eating. After a while, he said, "That board needs seeing to," she said. "I heard it this morning." He nodded. That was all. He fixed it in the afternoon while she worked at the table. She could hear the hammer from where she sat. 5 strikes, a pause, 3 more, silence. Then footsteps across the yard. She did not go to the window. When he came in, he did not mention it. He poured water, drank, set the glass on the sideboard exactly where he had set it that morning. She kept her eyes on the seam she was running. The fabric was one of the shirts he had left by the door 2 nights ago. It had needed nothing done to it that she could see, but she had looked more closely and found the small separation under the left arm, not visible when worn, only visible when you knew to look. She had not told him she found it. She finished the seam and held the shirt up to the light and checked her work. Clean, even, no gap where there had been one. She folded it and set it aside. The days had begun to have a shape. She woke before the light and built the fire, and had coffee ready by the time she heard him in the yard. He came in and drank standing, looked out the window at whatever the morning was doing, and set the cup down. She did not speak until the coffee was in her, and she was ready to. And he seemed to understand this without being told. Breakfast, the sound of him leaving, the long, quiet middle of the day, with only the work and the occasional sound of the boy next door calling to something in the field. She had not expected the quiet to feel like company, but it did. She had not expected a great many things. She returned the shirt to him that afternoon, folded the same way she had found it, set on the same corner of the table. He picked it up and turned it once in his hands. He did not open it to check the seam. He set it on top of the others by the door. "You don't have to do all of them, T," he said. His back was still to her. "I know, T," she said. He picked up his hat and went out. She sat for a moment, then pulled the next shirt toward her. That evening he came back with a paper package. He set it beside the sewing basket without comment. She looked at it after he had moved away to wash his hands. She opened the paper carefully, folding back one corner at a time. Inside, a spool of black thread, a spool of the palest gray, and a small paper of pins, the good kind, with glass heads. She had been using the thread from her own kit, the last of the gray nearly gone. She set the spools beside each other on the table. She did not know how he had noticed. She had not said anything. She had simply been more careful, more sparing, making the last of it stretch. She was still looking at the spools when he sat down. "Thank you," she said. "General store had them in," he said. That was all he intended to offer, and she accepted it. She picked up the gray spool and turned it in her hands. It was the right weight, the right shade, not white, not quite silver, but that particular in-between color that disappeared into pale fabric so that the work became invisible. The way good work always should. She set it down. The light through the window was going orange at the edges. He had poured himself water and was reading something at the far end of the table, one hand flat against the page. She pulled the next piece of fabric from the pile. It was one of hers, a sleeve she had been putting off, the seam at the shoulder more complicated than she had time for until now. She laid it out and looked at it. Outside, something moved in the grass, a bird maybe, or just the wind finding a new direction. She picked up the needle and began. The sleeve took her 2 evenings. The shoulder seam was the kind of work that could not be hurried. The fabric had to be held at a particular angle. The needle guided through 3 layers at once, and if the tension was wrong, even by a little, the whole line would pucker when it dried. She had done enough of this kind of mending that her hands knew it, but knowing and doing were different things, and she had to stop twice and rethread when the light shifted and she lost the angle. He did not disturb her. He came in both evenings around the same hour, set water on to heat, moved through the kitchen with that particular economy of his. Nothing wasted, nothing announced. The second evening he brought in wood for the morning before she had thought to ask, stacking it beside the stove with quiet deliberateness. She heard the thud of each piece but did not look up. The child appeared in the doorway the second evening with a marble in each hand, wanting to show her something. She set her work down and listened to a long explanation about which marble was faster on which surface. He came to stand in the kitchen doorway and watch the explanation without interrupting. When the child finally wound down and wandered back toward the hall, neither of them said anything about it. But she noticed he was still standing in the doorway a moment after he had any reason to be, looking at the place the child had been. He went back to the far end of the table. She finished the seam the second night, just as the lamp needed trimming. She held the sleeve up and turned it slowly, looking at the line from every angle. It was straight. The thread had disappeared the way it was supposed to, the work invisible, the fabric restored to something close to its original self. She set it in the pile with the others. She did not say anything about it, and neither did he. But in the morning, when she came down and the stove was already going, She saw that he had moved her finished pile to the far edge of the table, away from where he sat to eat. He had done it carefully. The pieces were still in order. It was such a small thing. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, with the light still gray and the house still quiet around her. And she did not know quite what to do with how steady she felt. Not happy. Steadiness was not happiness. It was something older than that. Something she had not expected to feel again in a house that was not her own. She put the kettle on. The kettle was slow that morning. A cold front had come through in the night, and the house held the chill in its corners even with the stove going. She stood close to it while she waited, her palms turned toward the iron. He came down shortly after. He did not comment on the cold. He went to the wood box and brought in two more pieces without being asked, set them beside the stove, and that was all. They ate without much talk, the way they had settled into over the preceding days. He had coffee. She had tea. The window showed a sky the color of old pewter, flat and low, and the ground outside was hard with frost. After breakfast, he told her the widow Albrecht had sent word the day before. A hem on a Sunday dress, and something wrong with a sleeve lining. He set the note on the table beside her. He did not wait to see what she did with it. She went. The widow Albrecht lived 4 streets over, in a house that smelled of cedar and dried flowers, and something underneath both that was simply age. She was a small woman, not unkind, who looked at the scar on the back of Clara's hand the way most people did. A quick glance, then away, then back once more when they thought she wasn't watching. Clara set the trans on the table and went to work without acknowledging it. She pinned the hem, turned the sleeve, found where the lining had pulled free from the seam allowance and come loose at the cuff. While she worked, the widow talked. She talked about the cold. She talked about the summer. She talked, eventually, about the man whose house Clara was staying in, with a careful, sideways kind of interest that was trying to appear like nothing more than idle conversation. Clara listened. She did not correct anything the widow said, and she did not add to it. When the work was done, she folded the dress, accepted the coins the widow pressed into her hand, and put on her coat. The walk back was short. The air bit at her face, and her breath came in small white clouds, and the street was quiet, most people still inside against the cold. She passed the livery. She passed the general store with its windows fogged from within. By the time she reached the house, the light had shifted. Thinner now, winter light, slant and brief, and smoke was coming from the chimney in a straight line because there was no wind. She stopped at the gate for just a moment looking at it. Then she pushed it open and went in. He was at the table when she came in, a sheet of paper in front of him and a pencil beside it, though he was not writing. He looked up when she opened the door. She unwound her scarf and hung it on the peg, and he watched her without moving. She said it had gone well. He nodded and looked back at the paper. She set the coins on the counter. She had taken to leaving them there, tallying what she owed him, and went to the stove to check the temperature. The fire was good. He had added wood while she was out. She stood there a moment with her hands near the warmth and did not say anything about it. Supper was quiet in the way their suppers had become quiet. Not empty, but settled. He ate slowly. She had made something simple from what was in the larder, and he said it was good, and she said there was more if he wanted it, and he took a little more. Outside the light was gone now, the window black, and the cold pressed at the glass in that particular way it did in December, something almost alive in the pressure of it. After, he cleared the plates. She had noticed he always did this, took them from the table without being asked, without comment, and set them in the basin with more care than the task required, as if washing a dish were something that deserved attention. She sat with her mending. He sat across from her. The candle between them had burned low through the day and was lower now. The light it gave, warmer and smaller, pulling the room in around them. He said, after a long while, that the widow had likely asked about her. She said she had. He said he supposed that was to be expected. She said yes. He was quiet. His hands were flat on the table. the left one near the edge, and she watched him without appearing to watch him. There was something he was deciding. She could see it in the stillness of him, the particular quality of stillness that was not rest but consideration, he said. She didn't have to stay if it had become difficult. She looked at him then, directly. The candle moved between them. She said it hadn't become difficult. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked away, out toward the black window, as if checking the weather through glass he couldn't see through. She went back to her mending. He stayed at the table. Neither of them moved toward the door. The candle went on burning, shorter now, but not yet gone. Its small circle of light holding the two of them together inside the cold and the quiet of the house. The candle burned down to the tin before either of them moved. He rose first, not because the evening was over, but because the candle was. And he went to the shelf where he kept the extra ones and came back and set a new one in the holder and lit it from the dying wick before the old flame went out entirely. She watched his hands do this, the care of it, the way he made sure there was no darkness between the two flames. He sat back down. She set her mending aside. Outside, the wind had come up off the open country, the way it did in the small hours, moving through the gap between the barn and the house, with a low, steady sound like breathing. The boy was asleep. The house was quiet in the particular way it had become quiet over these months. Not empty, but settled. There was a difference, and she knew it now. She said, after a while, that the dress was nearly finished. He nodded. She said she thought it had come out well enough. Better than she'd expected, given the cloth. He said he believed her. She folded her hands in her lap. He was looking at the candle. She was looking at the space between them, the width of the table, the two cups that had held coffee and now held nothing, his left hand still near the edge, nearer than it needed to be. She reached out and set her hand over his, not a gesture that announced itself, not one that asked a question, just her hand, placed over his and then still. He did not move for a long moment. She could feel the warmth of him through her palm, the rough of the knuckles, the slight give of him, as he turned his hand slowly beneath hers and held it. The candle moved in a draft from somewhere. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. They both looked at the candle, and the candle burned, and the wind went on outside, and somewhere far down the road a horse shifted in a stable, and the sound carried and was gone. After a while he stood with her. She picked up the mending, tucked it under her arm. He took her cup and his cup to the basin without being asked. She walked to the door of the room where she slept. She stopped there for a moment without turning around, and he did not say anything. And she did not say anything, and then she went in and closed the door softly behind her. In the front room, the candle went on burning. It burned for a long time after that.